So welcome guys to Crisis and Business Continuity. Last time we were looking at crisis communication and handling the media, and of course we also did exercise around organizational resilience in practice. This week, very interesting topic. We'll be looking at crisis leadership skills and competence. And why does this really matter? So I'll be talking you through the reasons why crisis leadership in terms of skills and the competences required at a time of crisis is absolutely essential. So the key issues I want to really dive into today relates to linkages between leadership and crisis management. So we're looking at why leadership, why do you think that leadership is so crucial at a time of crisis? We'll also look at some of the qualities that a good crisis leadership leaders needs to possess. And then of course we'll wrap it up by looking at the implication of that for organizations. We're looking at leadership skills and implication for organizations. But the question I have for you today is really to look at why do you think leadership is so crucial during crisis situations? What are some of the reasons that you have that leadership is so essential at a time of crisis? So we need to reflect on that as I take you through this journey on crisis leadership skills and competence. Of course, a bit of reminder is over the course of this particular module, we're looking at a wide range of topic. And today I just want to remind ourselves why at a time of crisis, we know that crisis actually requires a rapid response, and we also emphasized in previous weeks that there's a limited windows of opportunity for leaders to respond at a time of crisis because it is so structured. There is no any clear defined pathway to manage crisis situation, and that is why leadership is absolutely essential at a time of crisis because you can't tell from the onset, you cannot say precisely from the onset what is going to be the effect of whatever response you're going to put forward. So that is why leaders need to develop appropriate skills. That's why we're looking at crisis leadership skills and competence today. And of course, just a bit of reminder, one of the things that we mentioned in the past was that crisis has this level of threat, poses a very serious impact, can have serious impact on organizations, and how organization responds, how leaders respond can have impact on the organizations and even reputation of that particular organization. So leaders need to take crisis seriously. And of course, because there's a limited windows of opportunity to respond as well, that is also another area that I believe that leaders need to pay attention to. And we also mentioned in the previous weeks that crisis can also create a bit of stress for managers, for leaders in an organization. So that's something you need to take into account when you're looking at these issues of crisis because of the peculiar features that it has and the impact it could have, the uncertainty that comes with that as well, and the fact that there's a possibility for leaders making flawed decisions that are not right. So that's why it is important to have some bit of training and also to know what sort of skills, what sort of things that are absolutely essential at a time of crisis. Again, a bit of reminder. So in summary, we just to highlight what we look at when we look at crisis management. So over the course of the module, we'll be looking at crisis management as something that allow you to, catalog potential crisis situations. And of course, you can devise policies and frameworks in place to deal with this. And then of course try to formulate strategy to manage these potential crashes that can have an impact on the organization. And of course, the next logical thing to do is to try to look at who will be affected. In this case, you're looking at wide range of stakeholders. You're looking at stakeholders that may be affected. And that being said, you also want to devise effective communication channel. Last time we looked at crisis communication, so we emphasize why crisis communication actually matters in the process of crisis management. So because you want to minimize the impact, you want to minimize possible damage to reputations and also impact on the organization image as well. So of course, crisis management also deals with testing everything through. So crisis management is not about prevention of crisis itself, but when a crisis do happen, How do you rapidly respond and deal with it? But of course, we emphasize in one of the weeks when we're looking at business continuity planning too, I emphasize the need to have an effective business continuity plan and to make sure that this is embedded within the organization. And it's not just to embed the continuity plan within the organization, but to make sure that the plan is being tested across the board and ownership. We know who is responsible for what. So that is another issue to keep in mind. So that being said, so I just want to sum it up by saying that speed is essential, and this is why leaders uh, really matters. This is why leaders crisis leadership actually matters, because speed is essential because of the rapid nature of the effect that crisis can have within a short period of time. So leaders need to respond in providing a speedy response to potential crisis. And the lack of that response, if it is not there, it can have a dramatic impact. And some other people have said that that response is what differentiates organizations that are more likely to succeed and organizations that may not in the event of crisis. So we know that, but of course, leaders needs to provide that reassurance principle in every crisis situation. So every stakeholders want to know whether they are going to be safe, whether their jobs are safe from employees' point of view, and of course we've been looking at a local committee depends on the nature of the crisis, and we've been looking at these previously. So your job as a leader is to reassure them of this, to provide that level of reassurance. So why does that really matter? We want to know that you want to be forthcoming about everything you know and what you don't know. So credibility rests on this particular principle. Be forthcoming about what you know, what you don't know. That is absolutely essential. Don't try to make it up. We emphasized that when I was looking at crisis communication and how you actually handle the media in the previous lecture, crisis communication. So that being said, so what are the roles of crisis managers? So let's look at some of the roles of crisis managers. So we know we've been looking at crisis, we've been looking at crisis leadership, we've been looking at issues relating to crisis management. I've tried to, as much as possible, to emphasize that earlier on. So some of the roles, there are five different areas that I can easily point at, which involve across that crisis manager can play roles when it comes to managing crisis. So one of it is to work towards crisis, preventing the crisis situation from happening and try to minimize the impact if it happens. So that could be one thing why within the organization before crisis happen, successful crisis management do not start at the time of crisis. So they start before even a crisis begin. So you want to also look at before the crisis happen. So the crisis managers needs to plan response, recovery activities, and also to rehearse. I may emphasize the value of planning and exercise and testing. So rehearsing what response is going to be put in place, rehearsing who is going to be responsible, not having multiple stakeholders. We'll look at that in previous weeks as well. And so these are really important to look at. And the other point I want to mention is that when a crisis will happen, so you have responsibility as a manager to deal with the onset of it before as it is emerging, as that problem is happening. So you have that responsibility to deal with it. And the other point relates to if it do happen, so managers need to look at the possible areas, the impacts that could happen on the organization in terms of resources, personnel, and of course provide appropriate response now based on what measures have been put in place before the crisis do happen. So the final part I want to mention here is the number 5 is to look at after a crisis happen. So you have to make sure that you are involved in managing recovery and restoration program activities of the organization, that you effectively involve coordinating different stakeholders as a crisis manager. And you may not have the title of a crisis manager, but that doesn't mean that you can get involved and lead from the front. So one of the things that I want to emphasize again before I go into some of the keys, some of the qualities of what may of effective crisis leaders, is for us to consider leadership in culture. Why? Because we know that leaders need to look at the impact of all the strategies and decisions, both at the time the decisions are taken and an ongoing basis. And the culture of the organization, the rich culture of the organization can have an impact in terms of how leaders actually respond at the time of crisis. And that's why it is important to try to seek to build a culture in which it is normal to consider issues like resilience within your decision makings of the organizations as you're making decisions within the organizations. And you want to make sure that you clearly empower staff as well with a culture of trust and openness and innovations. We emphasize this over and over again when I was looking at issues relating to organizational resilience. I emphasized why the ideas around openness and flexibility and innovations and creativity are so powerful in helping businesses to develop the needed resilience that they could leverage on to bounce forward at a time of crisis. And finally, I just want to emphasize the need to have a very clear line of authority and responsibility. So authority responsibility needs to be delegated to the appropriate individuals within the organization so that there is no room for confusion as at a time of crisis. So that's essential. So again, taking it forward, just to wrap it up around culture and leadership here, transparency I've mentioned that needs to be encouraged. Information needs to be sharing needs to be very proactive across the internal boundaries within the organizations and across different partners. And leaders approach needs to consider all stakeholders. So you need to look at different stakeholders who may be affected and what measures to put in place to deal with them. So finally, when you look at this, the key point I want to make mention of is to create that constructive environment where you break down every sort of bureaucratic barriers that can separate the leaders who are managing the crisis because you don't want to create an atmosphere of distrust. So that is important to have an atmosphere, a constructive environment that everyone can contribute to. So you don't want to be judgmental, but at the same time, there are certain leadership qualities that have been found time and time again that are essential at a time of crisis. And I just want to talk to you through them. I'll wrap it up with some of the skills and competence that is required also at the time of crisis. And of course, we're going to look at leadership at a time of crisis, the new normal and the age of crisis, and what should leaders be doing. We'll wrap it up there. So the first thing I want to mention is at the time of crisis, some of the qualities that is so essential at the time of crisis is to provide accurate information. So providing accurate information to make sure that you giving every stakeholders you open, you providing current and candid and accurate information to every stakeholders that may be affected by crisis. We saw time and time again where leaders, some leaders are trying to hide information, they're trying to hide the facts. This is not helpful at a time of crisis. So being able to provide accurate information at a time of crisis is a good quality that leaders need to possess. And of course, I want to mention to the need to have critical resources that is needed because without them and without the essential resources that you need to help people to assess the things that they should respond to very quickly. That's something that organization leaders needs to help the organization to achieve. Other things is to provide support and encouragement at time of crisis. One of the other qualities, number three here, these are not in any particular order, but you want to provide support, you want to provide encouragement to employees, to different stakeholders. You want to make sure that your organization is on top of the game, and of course, you want to be accessible and approachable at a time of crisis. So this is really important that leaders needs to have this sort of quality. The other point I want to mention is to taking appropriate actions. Of course, decision making is absolutely essential. So you cannot afford to sit on the fence without taking appropriate action. So you need to be able to take that, make decision, take appropriate action at a time of crisis. So so having said that, the other point, quality that is also essential is to have a very channel of your communication, keep it open, make it open, make it accessible, so that you want to promote that constant dialogue, a two-way communication that encourages information from both sides, from the organization side and also from external stakeholders outside the organization. So keep it open, and also showing honesty and integrity. It is absolutely essential. It's one of the qualities that leaders need to possess at a time of crisis. So great leaders have that, and adapting when necessary. You need to be able to adapt when it is necessary to do so, and of course staying for the long haul. So crisis is not something, sometimes it could actually precede the time that you've anticipated. So you need to be able to stay until the crisis is over. So this is also an essential qualities that good leaders, good crisis leaders needs to possess. And we talked about working through recovery as well. So this is another areas where you're looking at helping the organization over the recovery and restoration process to get the business back to normal. So that being said, we mentioned some of the skills that is needed. So what are those skills that's needed? I'm talking about empathy. You need to be able to empathize, put yourself in position of others, and of course, you want to make sure that when you are communicating, you need to show humbleness, and you need to show and lead by example. You want to make sure that you're providing accurate, effective information that allow people to see that you taking decision in their best interest. So empathy is one of those keys. And you're talking about truthfulness. Well, I did mention that at a time of crisis, there's a need to say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So in crisis situations, you don't know everything. So you need to be truthful. You have to be clear about what you know and what you don't know. You need to be transparent about it as well. And the other point is clarity. So being able to have that actions through effective clarity, provide a clear language, provide a very clear set of instructions so that people know what direction is the organization going. So these are important skills for leaders at a time of crisis. And of course, you need to be able to prioritize because you have different course of actions, you have different situations, you have different options at your table, but you need to be able to prioritize at the time of crisis. This is also an essential skill for leaders to possess. So prioritization, it is absolutely fundamental at a time of crisis. So we've looked at those four. And another thing is risk mitigation as well to help the organization to constantly think about situation awareness and being aware and make a decision based on that, and also help to mitigate possible impact of the crisis as well. So you need that. You need to have that. This will allow you to be more risk aware, and of course, but the more risk aware you are, the chances are that you're more likely to make the right call. You're likely to make the right decision for the organizations. Empowerment is also another skill. Empower your team, empower your teams to be able to take the right decision, to make the right call. These are really important at the time of crisis. Agility is another skill, to be organizational agility. They talk about it time and time again as something that leaders needs to be able to be agile, provide the needed skill. It is paramount that we need to be able to translate that. At the moment of crisis, you have to be able to make quick decisions. The way we make decisions, when you fail, you need to recover fast. You need that constant plan. You need to also try as much as possible to evaluate your plan. And constant change doesn't mean that you don't necessarily have to stay course, but you need to make sure that if there is a need to change, you need to be able to adapt. So agile leadership is absolutely essential, and it is skills that can be learned. So when you look at some of these keys at the time of crisis, and when we talked about communications, we look at leaders should be able to tell good stories, communicate clearly the messaging that the organization is trying to pass across to the external stakeholders and also to the internal stakeholders as well. So communication is absolutely essential at a time of crisis. We also mentioned issues relating to execution, being able to execute when it is needed, at the time it is needed, execute and execute. And of course, the final point I want to mention here is cost management. You want to look at the impact of crisis, and or of course, you want to look at possible areas in which you can help the businesses to minimize the impact that the crisis could have on the organization. So this is something that managers and leaders and organization needs to be aware of. And last but not the least, the final point I want to make here is that leaders needs to understand the cost aspect of their decision as well. So that needs to be taken into account. And of course, we mentioned prioritization earlier. So leaders needs to be able to look at that and prioritize the right course of action for the organization. So we looked at this, but the other questions I want to pose to you is, why are some leaders better at managing crisis? Why do you think some leaders are much more effective in managing crisis? And I want to speak to this very quickly. So we know that based on the literature's intelligence is one of the things that have been pointed out. So cognitive intelligence, not emotional intelligence now, but when you're looking at cognitive intelligence, it is really important. Some of the key things that differentiate effective leaders from not effective leaders at the time of crisis. And of course, we also mentioned the fact that you're looking at situations where we are living at a time where we are so data driven, but ability to make sense of the data is absolutely essential, and this require intelligence to be able to do that. So your ability to learn and adapt very quickly to the changing situation, it is fundamentally essential at the time of crisis. The other point I want to mention is the accurate threat sensitivity. You want to be able to sense what is happening, more like akin to a situation awareness, and see what can go wrong and see what sort of measures can be put in place to deal with it. Having that sense of security can be extremely problematic, particularly maybe if you're looking at situations where you want to remain calm and all that, but you need to be making sure that you're very accurate and very sensitive to what is going on within the business environment. So you want to be sure that you very very much aware of what is going on within the business environment. The other point relates to courage to do the right thing, to make the right decision, to make the right call in the interest of the organization. This is really essential. You may want to think that, yeah, it's something that anyone maybe can easily say this is more like obvious, but to do it is what really makes the difference. To do that, to make that right call is what truly makes the difference. And then of course you want to also make sure that effective leaders, what makes them really is being able to remain trustworthy. One thing is to be trustworthy, another thing is to remain consistent in throughout the period where you're leading the organization. So trust is absolutely essential, because without that you won't get the cooperation of the different stakeholders who may be affected, and that can have an impact on the organization in terms of the way they go about managing the crisis. So, in summary, so good crisis leadership looks like. What does it look like? Let's look at, you want to act with urgency. So there's a paper that was published in Harvard Business Review talking about the need to act with urgency, because this requires rapid response. I mentioned that at the earlier, crisis require rapid response. So act with urgency, right? So that's one thing. Communicate with transparency as well. Be truthful. I told you earlier about the need to remain truthful, to say the truth. All right, say the truth, say the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So this is fundamentally essential for any crisis managers, any crisis leaders to do. And then, of course, also to respond productively to any sort of misstep that may have happened. So this is something that if you are open, if you are transparent, if you are honest enough, you should be able to respond productive in a productive manner to any sort of misstep within the organization. So leader needs to know that and engage in constant updating, provide information to the media. When we're looking at crisis communications, we emphasize this. They need to constantly updating the wider stakeholders. So the final, this is my final talk. I want to look at very briefly leadership in the age of crisis. So we live in a time where obviously crisis is more like the new normal. It's becoming like every day, whether it be an economic crisis, infectious diseases, health crisis, financial crisis, all sort of crises, natural disasters, and the rest. So we'll live at a time where we getting crisis is getting covered. The organization needs to add, leaders needs to add. So, what are you waiting for things to go back to normal in your organization? Well, from what I have said so far, we know that leaders will require new skills to be able to adapt to what is going on within the business environment. It require urgency, sense of urgency, and high stakes and uncertainty that is there in the business environment. So these are crucial, and even after that as well. So if that is being said, so we can put that in context and say that leaders needs to act very quickly and foster adaptation as well, helping people to develop that practice that is needed. So these are crucial within the organization. The other point I want to mention is to give people, your employees, all across the organization, the opportunity to lead and experiment at a time of crisis. And I was just going to wrap it up by saying that you need to make sure that you don't sacrifice yourself as a leader. If you're leading, you need to make sure you don't sacrifice yourself and that you are delegating, getting people involved, bringing the widest stakeholders and get them involved at a time of crisis. This is absolutely essential. So this is what I've got to share with you today, and I hope that you find it absolutely useful. And of course, we'll be looking at other range of topics. We've got some other interesting topics lined up. We'll be looking at the crisis process, for example, managing charting the crisis process. We'll also be looking at topic around learning from crashes. How do we learn from crashes? We'll also, I believe, be looking at organizational resilience too. So we have other interesting topics that are coming up. So I look forward to you joining me next time when I'll be discussing crisis management and business continuity. And as usual, I'll see you again next time. So thank you so much until we see you again.